Hello there, my name is Juan. In the last series, we explored civil rights. Remember, civil rights are, essentially, the role of all people to engage in democratic practices, enjoy personal privacy, have access to justice, and be treated publicly with dignity and respect. The key word there is all. Defining and fulfilling the hope of that word, all, has been the motivation for hundreds of thousands of individuals who have taken part in civil rights movements throughout the United States history. By building upon the work of civil rights movements of the past, and by forming active civic associations, civil rights advocates have employed wide ranging strategies in their quest to expand civil rights to more people. Of course, change does not always come easy. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to identify each of the important voting right amendments in the Constitution and explain how each expands civil rights in America. Most civil rights reform movements in America have centered on including more and more people into American society. In other words, expanding the criteria for who can be considered a citizen. This push towards inclusion has centered around suffrage. Word alert! Suffrage means the right to vote. In fact, the majority of post-Civil War amendments have been dedicated to expanding suffrage. What? You don't believe me? Just take a look at the 15th Amendment, the 19th, the 23rd, the 24th, and the 26th. All of these deal with voting rights. But why is voting so important anyway? Let me introduce you to Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a French philosopher and diplomat, and he published an extremely influential book analyzing American society in 1835. His book is titled Democracy in America, and in it he writes, "The further the limit of voting rights is extended, the stronger the need is felt to spread them still wider. For after each new concession, the forces of democracy are strengthened, and its demands increase with its augmented power. Finally, the exception becomes the rule. Concessions follow one another without interruption, and there is no halting place until universal suffrage has been attained." Tocqueville was saying democracy is a revolutionary force because once it is introduced to one group, it creates a chain reaction where more groups demand the right to vote until all groups can participate in democracy. Always gaining power, the calls for equality demand to be met with reform and suffrage for more people. Let's start with the 15th Amendment. The 15th enfranchised African American males, or granted them the right to vote by declaring race is no bar to vote. The 15th Amendment was passed during the years which immediately followed the Civil War, a time period given the name Reconstruction, when federal troops maintained a presence in the old Confederacy. It was a time period of real enfranchisement, as African American males were able to vote and hold office for the first time in American history and use the political process to improve their lives. In addition to the 15th Amendment, another minority group gained the right to vote through an amendment to the Constitution. Would you be surprised to learn that women were granted the right to vote in 1919, just a little bit more than 100 years ago? Well, it's true, but it was not an easy road to universal suffrage for women. Historically, women have been heavily involved in civic associations, but were initially kept out of direct involvement in state and national politics. Despite these limitations, women played a pivotal role in mass democratic politics aimed at reforming American society and government. Women were fierce advocates for the abolition of slavery, humane prison reform, and the push for workers' rights. One of these reform movements, the women's suffrage movement, fought for the right to vote. In 1890, Wyoming became a state, and it was the first to allow female suffrage. Over the next 3 decades, more and more states granted suffrage to women, until finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. It granted women the right to vote, but states could still attempt to limit voting. Before we move on, time to show what you know. What did the 15th and 19th Amendment create? For many of us, our most direct effect on government and politics occurs around Election Day. Therefore, our right to vote is fundamental because it both recognizes and sustains participation in society by removing barriers that prevent participation. The 15th Amendment attempted to create universal male suffrage, which brought African American men into the system. The 19th Amendment attempted to create universal suffrage, period. End of story. However, states manage elections, and despite the 15th and 19th Amendment, states and local governments passed legislation known collectively as Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were designed to create racial segregation in public and private facilities, as well as to suppress voting rights in order to reinstate an older social order. For almost 100 years, different civil rights groups fought these laws till finally federal legislation and another amendment was passed to dismantle Jim Crow. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the passage of the 24th Amendment were further steps toward expanding voting rights by providing extra protection. Determined by a formula prescribed in Section 4, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act requires a pre-clearance for districts that have had a history of discriminatory practices. Pre-clearance means any change in election laws or redistricting requires federal inspection and authorization. The 24th Amendment made something called poll taxes, a state tactic to disenfranchise people, unconstitutional. Each marginalized group was compelled to engage in mass democratic politics, such as organizing within civic associations or labor unions, engaging in nonviolent protest, creating and spreading information through a free independent press, and petitioning the government, all in order to make these amendments a reality. Women's journey to universal suffrage, as well as Jim Crow laws, points to a deeper truth about the relationship between our government system of federalism and the ability for citizens to achieve social progress. Again, states have the ability to change the Constitution, so oftentimes change is organized and moved at the state level first, and then slowly spreads from state to state before reaching the federal level. This is a double-edged sword, though. States also manage elections, so they can stifle voting rights in America as well. Depending on how politicians use it, federalism can either slow the process of social change or move us forward to that more perfect union. This brings us back to one of the main takeaways from this course, the contradiction between the reality of American society versus the promise of our revolutionary tradition. Word alert! Revolutionary tradition refers to the democratic principles established by the Declaration of Independence, the constitutional structures, and the mass democratic practices guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. As Tocqueville observed, the dissatisfaction caused by this contradiction would motivate disenfranchised groups to fight for amendments like these during times of major change in America's future. And, with each addition, new contradictions arise that cause other tensions, which then result in a continuing fight for expanding civil rights. It's time to show what you know again. Why was the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment needed? Let's end this with a quote and some food for thought. John Lewis, a former civil rights activist and American politician, who also served as a Democrat in the House of Representatives for over 30 years, famously said, "Your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union." French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville said, "Agitation creates the desire to vote." Lewis's words resonate deeply with Tocqueville's observation. And, as other groups of people continue to fight to obtain citizenship status today, American society and government continues to face up to this contradiction and deal with the tensions that arise from it. So, little word of advice, respect your right to vote, because when it goes away, you have to fight to get it back. In today's lesson, we learned that civil rights required numerous constitutional amendments which expanded suffrage to different marginalized groups. We also learned that these amendments brought more people into electoral politics, which is a fundamental form of participation in a republican government. Finally, these groups also innovated numerous forms of mass democratic politics, uses the tension caused by contradiction between our principles and our social reality to force the Constitution to change. My vote is to end the lesson there. In the next two lessons, we'll look at the important role different civic associations played in using that tension to close the gap between our principles and our reality. But that's all for us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And as always, remember to vote, debate, and participate. Hey!